Welcome to the Alyosha Society, where we're pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness through great literature. All right, friends, this is video number 2 going through Gulliver's Travels, but we're not in the story yet. Remember, I told you in the first video that we're going to do 2 introductory videos. The first one, we focused on defining the historical biographical approach. We talked about all the things that you should take a look at about a book before you dive into the book. And then we spent a lot of our time talking about historical context for better understanding the life and times of Jonathan Swift. So let's see where we left off. This hopefully looks familiar to you. We spent a lot of time talking about the English Civil War. Do you remember the 2 sides in the war? Do you remember how the tensions built over several decades? King versus Parliament. War breaks out in 1642. King is abridged. That means his head was chopped off. In 1649, and in a similar way that the American Civil War still defines us and our identity, the same would have been true for Jonathan Swift. These tensions between those who were still loyal to the king and that system and form of authority and government called Tories, and then the Roundheads, those who are more sympathetic with Parliament, the Whigs. Now, that defined politics in England at the time. So part of what, again, I said all this in the previous video, part of what Swift is doing is exposing the ridiculousness of some of their tensions. So this is where we left off. Now, that brings us back to our keys to understand a book. Once again, remember the fancy pants term we're using for how to read a book, the historical biographical approach. Learn as much about the historical background and the biography of the author as you can to better understand the book. So we said that that would mean learning author, reason for writing, audience, time period, and genre. And in this video, we're going to focus more on author and genre. Author and genre. So let's get right to it. Who is Jonathan Swift? When did he live? What would have been the things going on in his world? Well, let's start with the year of his birth, 1667. All right, do the math here, friends. When Jonathan Swift was born, how long ago would the English Civil War have been? Remember, King Charles I was abridged in 1649. So he would have been born roughly 20 years after the English Civil War. Does that mean that when he was growing up, he would have heard a lot of stories about it? You better believe it. You better believe it. That would have been something that would have been very much a part of his upbringing and education. So he wrote Gulliver's Travels in 1726. Are those tensions still real at that time? Yes, they are. What else do we know about Jonathan Swift that may help us understand Gulliver's Travels a little better? Well, he was an Anglican minister. He's an Anglican minister. So, it's always good to know when you're reading a book, hey, is this someone who's hostile to the Christian faith, or is this someone who might be more friendly to the Christian faith? Well, Jonathan Swift was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, as well as being an Anglican minister. So those things are important to know, and we'll bring those things into play as we walk through the story. Now, depending upon what scholar you look at, some very enthusiastic pro-Swiftian scholars will say that he is the greatest, not one of the greatest, but the greatest writer of satire in the English language. Now that's a very bold statement. That's a very bold statement, but that's good to know. Good to know as you go into reading the book. What is he seeking to do because of all of this? He's an educated man. He's a minister. We know the time period he's living in, and he's seeking to expose folly in various areas of life. So this is what we call a satire. A satire. You're thinking, Bruce, I thought it was just a cool story about a guy that went on a lot of adventures and a lot of weird things happened to him that involved little tiny people and giants. Yeah, that is what happens. But there's a deeper meaning going on here. Now, this is a satire. Swift is actually making fun of a lot of things. We'll talk more about that as we get into it. So he's also, not only is he seeking to expose folly in all different areas of life, maybe religion, maybe politics, culture in general. You know, we see a lot of folks that do this today. We see a lot of websites. We see this on, social media. We see folks doing this today. Sometimes it's very appropriate and it's genuinely funny and it's very true. Of course, other times it's not. You can be the judge as to how good of a job you think Jonathan Swift does. But he's also exposing problems with what we call Enlightenment ideas. Enlightenment ideas. So Enlightenment ideas are beginning to take hold during this time. And if you remember from our Understanding Modern Man video, Bruce, that was a long time ago. I know. Maybe go back and check it out. Remember in the Understanding Modern Man video, we talked about the Enlightenment being this watershed, really this watershed philosophical event in history where, pre-modern man goes from thinking that the church has this authority and respect. There's a belief in an active God in the world, a view of scripture that is divinely inspired and that is God's revelation to man, to the Enlightenment that says, we're not really sure about any of that. And we kind of think that the new authority is going to be our own reason. And a perspective called deism starts to develop more during this time. The idea that, there's a God, but he's way out there somewhere and he sort of created the world and then he just kind of let it go. Sort of like an absentee landlord, sort of, if that makes sense. So more on that to come. Swift is going to be addressing all of this. So does this help? Are you getting a picture of who this man was, when he lived, what he would have been hearing about, talking about? I know this is a very, very, very small, teeny sampling. If you were going to dive into a work, my friends, then you would read an entire biography on Jonathan Swift, and you would just dig a lot more deeply and have a richer understanding. What I'm doing here is just teaching you how to fish. Okay, I'm just kind of teaching you how to cast the line and how to catch, the little ones. This is just a sampling of what the historical biographical approach looks like. Oh, really, guys? Seriously, are we going to do this again? Really? The worst Photoshop in history? You're going to put my face on Gulliver and yeah. Anyway, forget about it. Okay, that's author. So we've dealt with time period. We've dealt with audience a little bit. We've dealt with who Jonathan Swift was. Let's talk about genre now. Genre, and you know what that word means, right? Kind or type, or you might even use the word style. The example I used, I know previously, was music. What are different genres of music? What's your favorite genre of music? Like country, rap, classic rock, classical, jazz? Those are the types. Literature can also be divided up into genres. So what is the genre here? And then how does that impact how we understand it? Well, first of all, I want to reiterate, this is definitely not a children's book. You could read this to children, and I think they would find it fascinating. But they wouldn't be getting everything out of it necessarily that Jonathan Swift wanted us to get out of it. So, it's sort of like Narnia. When you read Narnia to little kids and they love Aslan and they love the wonder of Narnia and the animals, talking animals, and all that's really cool stuff. But then when you get older, you realize, oh, Narnia, actually can be understood on a much deeper level. This is a picture of the gospel and the Christian life and creation and the fall of man and regeneration and the end times, all these things, much, much deeper meanings. Well, Gulliver's Travels is sort of like that, in that it may seem a bit childish, but the story can be understood on another level. And on that level, it has a bit of a bite to it, a bit of a bite to it. Think about that. Think about what you think that means. I just kind of want to get the wheels turning a little bit before you get into the book. So let's talk a little bit about the genre of this book, and then in general. I was thinking about genre, and it kind of reminded me of like a baseball game. If you're going to play baseball, you have to understand the rules. You have to understand what it means to throw a pitch and to get a hit, and what a foul ball is as opposed to a fair ball, and what it means to get out, and what it means to run to first, second, third base, and home, and all of those things that are the rules of playing baseball. Well, in a similar way, I think genres have rules in a way. That is, ways that if you understand what the genre is and how you kind of play the game of understanding that genre, then when you get into a book of that genre, then you kind of know how to play the game. You know how to understand it better. You know how to navigate it. So let me give you a little an example here. We're in our second book here, Gulliver's Travels, and we have already covered one book. Well, it was a very different genre, wasn't it? So notice on the top here, I have allegory, which was the genre of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. What are the rules of allegory? Well, I'm trying to keep this very simple, very simple. I would say there are two big questions you ask when you're reading an allegory. What is the deeper meaning? Now, I could have added a third. I could have started with, what are the basic facts of the story? Well, if you were doing that with Narnia, then, Edmund gets into trouble. Aslan has to make an agreement to die in his place. Aslan then dies and he comes back to life. So he rescues Edmund. Okay, that will be the facts of the story. But I'm kind of jumping ahead to, okay, we know that you need to know that. So first question, what is the deeper meaning to the story? What is this allegory pointing to? And then remember, we're always looking back. How does it apply to me? Did you read The Pilgrim's Progress devotionally? When I read Narnia, when I read the stories of Narnia, I should be asking myself, okay, this is about salvation or sanctification or creation. How does that apply to me? How does this allegory impact me? Well, satire has a different set of rules, I think. Jonathan Swift's satire. So you might ask questions like, what specifically is the author making fun of? See, a satire is a work of literature that is exposing the ridiculousness or the folly of something. It's basically making fun of something, in a sense. That's what a satire is. So what specifically is the author making fun of? But then, after you look at the specific thing that the author's making fun of, then you can draw out of that, okay, generally speaking, what's the general principle here? Okay, so for example, maybe you write a story about a law that our Congress passed. Let's just do politics. A law that our Congress passes. And maybe you think that's a ridiculous law. So that's the specific thing you're talking about, is that law. But the more general thing that you're making fun of is Congress sometimes does ridiculous things. And then how might this apply in our world today? How does our Congress relate to that? Okay, you could also do it in religion. Okay, you could tell a story about two Christians who are fighting over something really silly. Maybe they're having a fist fight over whether or not Pepsi or Coke is the better drink. And they're getting really, really, really worked up over it. And the whole story is just ridiculous. Well, that's the specific thing that the author's dealing with. What generally is that story about? Well, generally speaking, sometimes Christians argue over silly things. How might this apply in our world today? Then I can start asking questions. What are the things that we Christians tend to argue about that are really kind of ridiculous and silly? You see that? So these are the rules. This is how you play the game. So we're going to shift gears from an allegory to a satire. So be thinking about that as we get into the story. We're also going to be answering questions like this. What exactly is satire? Is it an appropriate genre for Christians? That's an important question. Is it okay? I mean, the Bible has a lot to say about this. Is it okay for Christians to make fun of things? And if so, what are the boundaries? What are the limits? What are the parameters? Why do people even write satire in the first place? What makes it an appealing genre? In our particular story here, what's going on? Who are the main characters? And then how do you assess Jonathan Swift? After it's all over, how do you assess it all? Do you think he did a good job? Do you think he was able to communicate his message? Was he successful in his rhetoric? That's something that we'll be asking as well. So, how did we do? We're again looking at the historical biographical approach as opposed to critical theory, which says, I'm just going to get whatever I want out of a book. We're going to roll up our sleeves and do the work when we read books to learn about the author, the reason for writing, the audience, the historical time period, and the genre. Now, we've done a sampling of those things. Are you guys ready to go? Well, let's dive in. So you should go ahead and read part one. The most versions of Gulliver's Travels, I believe, are divided into 4 parts, and each part has various chapters to it. So what I want to do is focus on doing 2 videos on each part. So there'll be 8 more videos coming, and they're going to be a bit more general in not necessarily page by page, although we're going to do a little bit of that. We're going to look at the general places, the locations where Gulliver goes, and then talk about the satire of it. What exactly is Jonathan Swift trying to communicate in that part? Well, go ahead and get your reading done, friends. I hope our 2 introductory videos to Gulliver's Travels have been helpful for you. In the next video, we'll start at the beginning of Gulliver's Travels. I'll see you then.